Thursday on Teachers Talk Radio at 9 o'clock with me, Tom Rogers. In today's show, we are discussing imposter syndrome and this feeling that teachers feel a lot, which is you're never quite good enough. I'm joined by John Young, all the way from Australia. We'll be checking in and joining the conversation.
Live from Liverpool, this is The Morning Break with Tom Rogers on Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live on the Podbean app or desktop player. Just head over to www.podbean.com/LSW/TT Radio or search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TT Radio.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you are well this Thursday morning. I am live from Liverpool, where the weather has taken a turn for the worse. I'm afraid it is drizzly, grey, dark, and pretty morose looking out of my window at the moment, towards the Albert Dock. It's a bit choppy on the seas, and the weather has definitely deteriorated since the last few weeks, where we've actually had some reasonable weather for once. It's been quite nice recently. I don't know whether it's been nice where you are if you're in the UK. Talking of nice weather, today I'm joined actually by John Young, who's a head teacher over in Australia. I know I've got a friend who's obsessed with Australia, to the point where it's all she ever talks about. So it'll be nice to ask John what the weather is like in Australia and if it's reasonable out there, or are they in winter now? No, they're always in summer. Let's be honest, mentally they're always in summer. And probably it's a mistake to talk about imposter syndrome with an Aussie. In fact, I think he's a Kiwi. So we'll wait for him to call in. He can tell us where he's from. But either way, that was a joke, by the way, about Australians not having kind of self-mutilation like the Brits do. I'm sure he'll get it when he calls in. But anyway, in today's show, we are talking about this thing that we kind of term imposter syndrome, although actually, it encompasses a lot of things. It's not just the words imposter syndrome. This thing encompasses this feeling of guilt, this feeling of not feeling good enough, this feeling of not feeling productive enough. There's a lot of things there. Most of these emotions prove very toxic for teachers. They prove very difficult for them to deal with. And we're actually going to be reading and discussing a blog by Rachel Ball on the Educational Imposters blog, which you can find if you just Google the Educational Imposters. You can see the blog for yourself. And she wrote about lots of things that she feels guilty about. Now, I'll read it to you in a minute, but essentially, a lot of these things are things that perhaps are actually outside of her control, that actually are not things that she could change in particular. John, good morning. How are you today?
Oh, good. Thanks, Tom.
Excellent. Thank you so much for giving up the time to join me this morning. All this education stuff.
That's fine. You're fading in and out a bit, but we'll do our best, Tom.
Okay, brilliant. It sounds like you're moving some furniture, John. Am I prompting you to move house already?
No.
That's good then. So thanks very much for joining me. It's great to have you with us. And if I'm going to I've introduced you probably far too simply. Is simply a word? I don't even know. But I've introduced you very briefly as a head teacher in Australia. So would that be right?
Yes, but it's a pretty particular sort of school, Tom, if you want me to talk about it.
Hit me with it.
Okay, well, it's what we call a remote school. So if you can imagine from your listeners' point of view, thinking about outback, but it's when we talk about remote in Australia, it's an Aboriginal community a long way from any city. So we're about 6 hours by four-wheel drive from Darwin, except from December to May, we're actually cut off, so we can't drive in as the wet season comes in. So it's a large Aboriginal school in a community called Wadair, and a lot of social challenge in terms of very poor health, very low school attendance, unemployment, drug and alcohol issues, and at times the community can tilt to sort of fighting for a couple of months in. So it's quite a special school. It's a privilege to be there, but it's certainly a challenge. And then the other thing I have to point out is I'm not an Australian, I'm a New Zealander.
Yeah, I mentioned that actually because I made a joke, John, that you missed, and you probably would have enjoyed it, because I said we're talking about imposter syndrome, and I said, well, it's silly getting an Australian on because they probably wouldn't experience imposter syndrome ever. But anyway, you missed that joke. I thought it was funny. I thought it was modern, and then I said, well, actually, he's from New Zealand. So that joke is completely irrelevant anyway. But no, that sounds really interesting. So when you say about kind of, because I mean, I'll be honest with you, my levels of ignorance around kind of Australian geopolitics are quite severe. So when you say it's an Aboriginal community, can you kind of expand on that for our UK listeners as to what you mean exactly by that?
Well, it's a population of about 2,500 is our best estimate, and of that, 2,300 are all Aboriginal people.
Yeah.
And because it's isolated and remote, these are people who have kept their language, and so at school is the only time they engage with English, and largely kept their culture, which is a very good thing, but it has, there are many challenges associated with their life.
Yeah. And how did you kind of end up as head teacher in that community? Is that something that you sought out, or is it something you kind of fell into?
Well, it's my education life was until 2010 was pretty ordinary. I started teaching in the South Island, New Zealand, and then became a principal of Catholic primary schools in Wellington in the North Island. And then about 2010, I just finished a PhD, and I decided to seek fame and fortune. And like a lot of educators, this part of the world, I went to the Middle East, but I went to Libya, and we were there for about six months before the revolution started.
Yeah,
we had to go out in a bit of a hurry, and then I was sent to Egypt for about 8 months, and then I did some consulting in Dubai. But the company said, look, come April, the job's over, John. And it wasn't quite doing it for me, international education. So I wasn't ready to go back to what I was doing in New Zealand. And I looked around, and this job came up. And, I'd spent time in Australia as a younger man before teaching, and I thought that sounded like an interesting, exciting challenge, and there wasn't a lot of competition for it, Tom.
Yeah.
Didn't have to. And so it's been 10 years, and a challenging but an interesting experience. It's certainly important work, and certainly challenges you, stretches you to skills and capabilities you didn't know you had.
Yeah, that's a fair. I mean, what I'm interested in there, and what you said about international education wasn't doing it for you. In what sense? What was the thing that kind of turned you off from going down that avenue?
Oh, look, the social justice has always been pretty important to me as far as schooling goes, and I didn't think that my experience of international schooling was meeting my needs in that area. So it's not to condemn other people, but it's one of the things.
No, I experienced that. That's one of the things I experienced. I taught out in Europe for 4 years, 3.5, 4 years, and that's something that I experienced. Was that feeling, even though I actually loved it. There was, a lot of the time, there was that nagging feeling in the back of my mind at times that I wasn't using my skills to make the greatest amount of difference that I could, even though, to be honest with you, kind of, I mean, it's debatable sometimes, when you're teaching in a let's say in a tougher context, it's sometimes hard to say, oh, you know what, I am making that difference? Because sometimes there'll be a lot of days where you come back and go, do you know what? I was making more difference out there because of that they were more receptive to what I'm actually doing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And I also think that if you want to commit to that sort of work, it's good to take spells occasionally 4 or 5 years and go and work in, say, more affluent, more supported communities. And, I think that's helped me that one of the schools I led was, reasonably affluent for New Zealand standards. And that, gave me an idea of what can happen and, what's possible, So, and, I'd never left Australia and New Zealand much beforehand. So it was a very exotic journey.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of so you've arrived in the school, presumably from what you've said, maybe about 2013 or something in the current role.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so you've been there for a while. So is that so? What would you've arrived there as a head teacher? It's obviously a tough gig in some respects. What's your kind of leadership mantra then? What's been your thing that you've kind of said to yourself to keep yourself going during this period of time?
I think, firstly, I've managed or been blessed to attract and keep quite a good number of really good staff, and seeing the lives of the people you're working with, the Aboriginal people, how tough they are, but some real goodness in them, and trying to make a better place. What's worked for the sense of making a difference, even though it's in sense that, look, it is important work, and it's one of the biggest challenges I think Australia faces, and seeing that. And it's also, it's the intellectual challenge I actually find quite exciting, just thinking really deeply, talking with your good people about how we could improve this.
Yeah, and what do you think? I mean, that's a long time to work as a head teacher in any school, right?
It is.
So what do you think you've learned in that period? I mean, what would, if you were to say, 2 or 3 things that really stand out to you, or even just one thing that really stands out to you that you've learned in that time, what would it be?
I think there's a lot of commonality between good teaching and good schools anywhere. I think that differences in schools, differences in teaching are a lot smaller than we think. And, there's a lot of commonality. I suppose that's one thing I've learned. I've learned the importance of having really good people be with you. And I suppose taking care of yourself, which sort of gets to the theme of today, sort of developing your own personal internal resilience.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the word resilience, I always think that whenever anyone's been in a school like that, in that context for a long period of time, I think it's that resilience. It's saying, you know what, I'm going to get up and do it again and keep chipping away. Now, interestingly, before we actually move on I'm going to read this blog in a minute by Rachel Ball, which I really resonated with me when I read it yesterday, and I'm going to read it and then we can have a discussion about it. But before we do that, I mean, do you experience imposter syndrome as a head teacher and leader? Is that something that you...
Huge, Tom. Yeah, and I remember it must have been 20 years ago now, back in New Zealand, and on a rather late night, a fellow principal and I we're talking about, we're joking and saying, we're not real principals. One day, they're going to come into our office and say, how long did you think you could kid people? And we compared ourselves to the principals early in our career and how more serious they are, and they probably never drop the F-bomb in the staff room and things like that. And I think I was sharing that with my sister, who's a GP, and she said, look, in medicine, there's actually a name for that, Dr. Fraud, and we, talk about it a lot. So, yeah, I think one of the things Rachel's saying is, it's a very healthy for her to say it. The people each side of her feel that way. The the leaders feel like that way, and it's good to get it out and discuss it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna read it now, and then we can kind of discuss it. But basically, the blog is entitled 40 Things I Feel Guilty About. Now, I'm not going to read the entire piece, but it starts off, maybe it's because I'm a working mum, my religious background, my imposter syndrome, or maybe it's because of my age, but guilt is a frequently felt emotion in my life. As Elizabeth Day's Guardian column hit me hard. And like her, I wonder how much more productive my life would be if I let go of some of the guilt that I carry around like a heavy backpack. Certainly, I know I'd sleep better, probably stop stress, eating biscuits, and maybe even live in the moment more. Elizabeth herself muses, it makes me wonder, what could we achieve with all that energy wasted on unnecessary shame? The sock drawer might get organized. I might read War and Peace. Maybe, just maybe, I forgive myself. And then perhaps we could all ourselves all believe in our own worth just as we are. Now, what Rachel then does is she then lists 40 things that she feels guilty about, basically, and I thought we could maybe read through some of those, and maybe John, if you want to shout at any point and say, you know what, I've got something to say about that one, then that would be cool, and I'll also chip in with my own thoughts on these as well. But she starts off saying, I feel guilty that I'm not a more inspirational teacher. That's number one on her list. John, have you ever felt similar guilt? I feel guilty I'm not a more inspirational teacher.
Or leader, yes, frequently.
Yeah. I mean, I have definitely at times. Yeah, and I do think, you know, it's interesting, that word inspirational. It's interesting, the perception of inspiration, because to me, like, sometimes in certain schools, like turning up every day and being there as a presence is pretty inspirational for a lot of kids. You know, the fact that you're there, the fact that you're doing it, you know, week after week, month after month, year after year, even decade after decade, that in itself can be quite inspiring to kids deep down. I mean, obviously they might not relate that to, you know, the classical idea of an inspirational teacher stood on a table doing like a Robin Williams, but they might see it as, you know what, over time when they're older, they'll be like, that was really inspirational. That person was there throughout my entire schooling.
Yeah, I think, just being there, and especially in our context, being there, staying there, being predictable, you know, is really important.
Yeah, and she goes on, number two, I don't always leap out of bed ready for another day at work. Well, I definitely don't. Number three, I have 10 gigabytes of podcasts I need to listen to on my phone, but I keep adding more. Well, I can't really talk here from Teachers Talk Radio when we've got like 5 shows a day that appear as podcasts, and we're just wrecking people's lives daily by producing so much content. But certainly, I think there is that issue of productivity there, isn't there? And I don't know whether for yourself, John, do you listen to podcasts?
I do. I great fan of all levels.
Oh yeah,
Education Research Reading Room. Look, I suppose for me it flicks the other way. I do a lot of that, and then I think, you're a very sad man. You should have other hobbies. What are you going to do when you retire? But I also resonated with that, and how many more books I've got on the shelves I need to read. But look,
do you ever feel guilty? Do you ever feel guilty when you not guilty, but less productive when you haven't listened to what you were supposed to listen to? Do you feel weirdly?
Yeah, no. I've learned to live with that. Yeah.
Have you got a particular kind of podcast that I mean, you mentioned Ollie Lavelles, but is there any other podcast or any other podcast episode that you really resonated with you?
I like Filling the Pail. That enjoys me. Literacy is quite a strong interest of mine. So I've just started listening to the Reading League and the Science of Reading podcast. So, you know, I find those helpful on my good days when I get up and go to the gym early.
Yeah. Don't make me feel guilty now, John. Number 4, I leave home before my kids are up in the mornings. yeah, I mean, this is something I often dwell on. This is the compatibility between, you know, family and teaching, and how difficult that is, and how difficult that can be.
Tom, when I was